After the inevitable focus on Lewis Hamilton's debut and Charles Leclerc talking of an obsession to win an F1 title, Ferrari's dream team suffered an immediate setback. For all the expectation around its super team driver lineup this year and Ferrari's strong end to 2024, its 2025 campaign has now started in a very muted way. Hamilton's much anticipated first race with Ferrari was undermined by a qualifying nightmare for the team, as he and Leclerc only qualified on the fourth row of the grid, and they only scored 5 points between them in the race too, with Leclerc 8th and Hamilton 10th, as both drivers were compromised further by a strategic misstep worryingly reminiscent of past Ferrari failings. It was far from the start F1's most successful driver and team hoped for and expected. Team boss Fred Vasseur described it as not a shock, but for sure not a good weekend, admitting Ferrari has a lot to learn because it made mistakes and needs to improve its communication. He pledged Ferrari will be much better in this weekend's Chinese Grand Prix. So just how bad was Ferrari's start to 2025? Ferrari having grand expectations and then falling short is a bit of a broken record, but while this had the air of familiar frustration, it's not an exact repeat of past false dawns. Back in 2022 or 2019, Ferrari burned brightly in pre-season testing, but their early in-season promise faded. This is a different kind of disappointment, and while it might look like falling at the first hurdle, Ferrari is viewing it as a perfect storm of factors that conspired against them. The event started with Leclerc talking optimistically about how much room there was for Ferrari to improve from an unconvincing pre-season test, because it had yet to scratch the surface with optimising its new car, instead opting for more data collection about how it responded to vastly different setups. Then, on Friday in Melbourne, Leclerc was quickest in second practice at a time Ferrari still seemed to be fine-tuning the car's balance. All looked well. But as Saturday rolled around and qualifying progressed, the Ferrari narrative quickly lost momentum. Its prospects for the race collapsed when the SF25 ate through its rear tyres and neither driver had enough grip at the end of their qualifying laps. To put this in context, Leclerc's best lap was less than a tenth slower than Lando Norris 3 corners into Sector 3, but 3 corners later, 2 being slow and traction demanding, Leclerc was a whopping 0.659 seconds off pole. The Ferrari straight-line speed profile looked very similar to the McLaren's, but neither Leclerc nor Hamilton was able to match the McLaren or Red Bull speed through the fast turns 9 and 10, and still this was enough to tip their rear tyres beyond that tricky temperature threshold. The implication after qualifying was Ferrari had been too slow to adapt to the changing track conditions on Saturday when it was extremely hot. And to be fair, when the car's not being limited by its rear tyre temperatures, it has appeared so far to have inherited the positive traits of its recent predecessors: nimble in slow corners, good curb riding, and strong on traction and initial power delivery. Such positives are what Ferrari was clinging to afterwards, as the team left Melbourne still feeling a strong conviction that qualifying and the race didn't reflect the real pecking order. Of course, you'd hope that was the case, given Ferrari got out-qualified by not only its main rivals, but also a Racing Bulls and a Williams, and Hamilton was not having any joy getting past those cars in the race, stuck under Alex Albon's rear wing in the wet conditions. Leclerc's glum verdict was that Ferrari were definitely very off in terms of pace compared to the McLaren's and Red Bull's Max Verstappen. Though the dry weather pace was concerning, it's not necessarily a precursor to a season of being in no man's land, if we are to believe that Ferrari simply failed to read the conditions properly, or just isn't quite on top of its car's sweet spot yet, or a bit of both. Vasseur insisted Leclerc's Friday practice pace and early qualifying performance were a better indication of Ferrari's true place in the pecking order, and that Q3 and the race were not the real picture of the season for sure. Ferrari really needs that to be the case, and for the steep fall off in qualifying to be an aberration. Vasseur pointed to how suddenly Verstappen went from splitting the two McLarens to being over a second per lap slower in the opening stint of the race because of tyres overheating. Again, that pointed to the root of Ferrari's troubles being the overuse of its tyres in qualifying, and paying the price for that on Sunday when track position was everything. Still, Vasseur conceded McLaren looked to be one step ahead, and Hamilton confessed he didn't know if Ferrari has anywhere near the pace McLaren had. But, Hamilton said, I do think the actual car has a lot more performance. We just didn't unlock it this weekend. Their hope is that Ferrari actually putting its best foot forward this weekend in China will help show the situation can be like the end of last year, when different teams won races because different circuits, track conditions and tyre demands swung the balance between them. Right now though, Ferrari and others are relying on a pretty big and sudden swing against McLaren. And even if that proves to be accurate, there is work to do, because regardless of whether the Ferrari is quicker than the headline results suggest, suggested in Australia, the whole operation has to be sharper. Leclerc and Hamilton were already well on their way to uninspiring results in Melbourne until the late race rain sprinkled some extra chaos into the mix. Then, Ferrari also seemed to go back to its pre-Vasseur days of losing its head when a quick strategic decision had to be made. By opting to stay out longer than others when the rain came, Ferrari blew their shot at a better result they could have gained by pitting early and making up places. Leclerc thought this was definitely a missed opportunity, but Ferrari also made its drivers' lives even harder than they already were. The moment of jeopardy completely threw Ferrari, which seemed to give the drivers conflicting information about whether there would be more rain. Hamilton, for example, was happy to stay out and try to ride out the damp patches because he wasn't aware the rain would intensify and stick around. Ferrari gambled that the rain would disappear and staying out would vault their drivers to the front. To be fair, the second thing did happen, but only very, very briefly. While Leclerc spun and lost several places, Hamilton very briefly took the lead when Verstappen pitted, so he has now led a lap in a Ferrari. But it was a desperate Ferrari ploy, one which meant the two cars eventually rejoined 9th and 10th when they had to stop for intermediates. To put this into context, Racing Bulls tried similar with Yuki Tsunoda and harpooned its own chances of a strong result. But Racing Bulls is historically very fragile strategically, and Ferrari needs to be keeping better company in moments like this. Beyond the strategy call itself, the race was laced with stress tests of another familiar old Ferrari weakness: communication. Ferrari's often been guilty of paralysing itself with indecision, issuing unclear instructions to its drivers or bombarding them with unhelpful information at the wrong time. A lot of attention, perhaps inevitably, was put on several Hamilton exchanges with his new race engineer Riccardo Adami, who was probably too heavy on information for Hamilton's taste. But although it got occasionally tense, this was nothing really out of the ordinary for a driver-engineer combination in the most frenetic moments of a rain-hit race, which are always tough to handle and even more so when they aren't going very well. Hamilton pushed back firmly when he felt Adami was overstepping, which is probably necessary if they're to build the kind of rapport that can ultimately maximise in future opportunities like the rain in Australia presented. That's where Hamilton and his old Mercedes race engineer Peter Boddington thrived. As for Leclerc, his own comms with Brian Botzi on their side of the garage produced some memorable moments too, notably a genuinely concerned Leclerc complaining about how wet his seat was and being told, in reply, it was probably the water. Funny though it was, it didn't project an image of a team in sync, which is rather indicative of Ferrari's entire weekend. Vasseur admitted it was not a clean one, and Ferrari needs to quickly find a better way to communicate.
Formula 1, endurance racing, sim racing, whatever your motorsport fix is, one thing's for sure, the right gear makes all the difference. And when it comes to footwear, Pilotti has been delivering performance-driven driving shoes for decades. From the paddock to the street, these shoes aren't just inspired by racing, they're built for it. And there's never been a better time to grab a pair because Pilotti's spring sale is on, with up to 30% off some of their most popular styles. Click the link in the description and use the RACEM 2025 discount code and get even more off, up to 45%. Whether you're looking for track-ready grip, all-day comfort, or something stylish to rep your passion for motorsport, they've got something for you. Take the Shift, for example, lightweight, durable and designed for serious driving, or the Drift Mid, which brings that perfect blend of performance and street style in a mid-top sneaker. And if you're after something even more laid back, the Cruise is down to just $99 right now. Pilotti is built for drivers. Each shoe has Pilotti's patented roll control heel. It's designed for smooth pedal transitions and all-day comfort, whether you're behind the wheel or just out and about. So if you've been eyeing a pair, now's the time. Head over to Pilotti.com, grab your favourites and save big before the sale ends. You won't regret it. They even ship worldwide now, so the race fans all over can get in on this crazy sale while it lasts.
At the start of the race, Leclerc inadvertently ran Hamilton out of road at the first corner and cost him a place to Albon, whom Hamilton had initially jumped off the line. And at the end of the race, having lost out because of his spin, Leclerc muscled his way back ahead. Hamilton was also passed on the last lap for 9th in a very committed around the outside of turn 9 move by the recovering Oscar Piastri. These losses of position didn't cover Hamilton in glory, although if you're being generous, you might argue Hamilton was wise not to fight his own teammate too hard, and Piastri's McLaren was on another level to the Ferrari in this wet dry race. The limp finish did little to help convey that Hamilton's debut was a grand success. It wasn't, but it also wasn't terrible. A wet race was always likely to be tough, given it was his first time in such conditions in a Ferrari, and he admitted he did feel like I was in the deep end. His progress in the dry probably went unnoticed by anyone not watching closely, because his headline times didn't offer much in any session. Hamilton felt his ultimate 2/10 qualifying deficit to Leclerc was a good foundation and was clearly happy to even be that close at the first attempt, although that's with the caveat Leclerc didn't complete a representative second lap in Q3. Hamilton openly admitted after qualifying it was a slower process to build confidence in the car compared to normal, and conceded he was lacking in the high-speed corners to Leclerc all weekend. There's no indication that Hamilton was lost, but at times he was perhaps a little overwhelmed by what to do to improve and how to do it most effectively. He admitted he wasn't yet in a position to automatically know what to change on the car to address specific issues, and said he thought he would be able to shortcut the learning process through hard work, only to discover in Melbourne that wasn't the case. For all that though, he has been extremely hungry to learn, happy to take advice that might normally be dished out to a rookie, not a 7-time world champion, and crucially, he started to put some of those lessons into action. By qualifying, Hamilton's driving tended to follow a more similar style to Leclerc's: lift and brake earlier for a higher minimum speed, rather than brake later, harder and longer, but he still needed bigger lifts and a little confidence boosting down with the brakes in the highest speed corners. Part of that is Hamilton's comfort in the car still being built up, but it didn't really make a difference in Australia anyway. Ultimately, Ferrari was the main limitation in the opening race, not its new driver.